So as was mentioned, I direct a security studies center at a think tank, and in particular wrote a book, a nonfiction book, Wired for War, about the history of the rise of drones. Some of the things in the prior talk, I think, were from that, from whether the warfare used to the story of Marilyn Monroe's discovery in a drone factory, to more importantly, it wrestled with some of the social, legal, ethical implications of the growing use of robotics, first in war and then moving over to the civilian side. And I continue to stay involved in this discourse, in particular helping to work with governments and military agencies, both in the US but also allied nations, and how to wrestle with the implications of this future and this future technology. And that's much the same in the upcoming nonfiction book on cyber war, which is basically trying to give people a tool for understanding this new domain. But what I thought I'd do tonight, and it's sort of funny, me coming from the policy world, is that I'm going to be the guy talking about the huge area of impact of drones on our lives, our world, our wars, but more importantly, on art itself, and try and use the story of these two projects that was mentioned as a way to illustrate some things that I think loom, that I've been playing in, but loom in the discourse here. And and then use those stories to illustrate how technology, whether you're talking about a stone or a drone, is simply a tool that people apply to a task, and a tool that can be used both for positive and negative. You know, the first stones that someone picked up, one person used it to build a wall or a house, and another person used it to bash someone over the head. And that's the same thing that's playing out today with this new version of a technology. But to pull back on this, one of the things that I think is most important about the story, the narrative of drones, is that the story of something essential to humanity. And it's really, for the last 5,000 years, this idea of going to war has basically meant the same thing. It meant you went to a place of such danger that you might never see your family again. That was the story of war. And some of the greatest works of drama and fiction have been about this experience. You know, whether you're talking about the foundational works of literature like the Iliad, to Hemingway, they've been focused on that story of the intensity of war. That's also when you talk about movies, whether it's Saving Private Ryan, Black Hawk Down, 12 O'Clock High, most recently the Academy Award winner, The Hurt Locker. But then the story of going to war has had another element to it. Not simply going to war and leaving your family behind, but then what happens to you when you come home. So if we go to literature, you have the Iliad, then you have the Odyssey. If we go to movies, we have Oscar winners like The Best Years of Their Lives, right after World War II, about veterans coming home, to The Deer Hunter, to more recently The Messenger. We've had this break, the story of going to war has been broken into two parts because that's the way it's always been for 5,000 years, whether it was for the real experience of war or the way the arts were telling this in fiction and drama. But this 5,000-year-old narrative, this truth of war, is breaking down. The U.S. military in the last roughly decade has gone from having a handful of unmanned systems, none of them armed, to now we have more than 8,000 in the U.S. military inventory. On the ground, it's from 0 to 12,000 when we're talking about ground robotics. More importantly, this story is not just an American story. The robotics revolution, it's not an American revolution. Besides the United States, there are 87 other countries that are building, buying, and using military robotics today, from nations like was mentioned in Israel, to China, to Russia, UAE, you name it. And so this is a global story, and I think we'll see a global discussion taking around it. And it's created huge changes in everything from how battles are fought to when and where our nations go to war, both in the overt wars, but more importantly, these shadow wars that we've been fighting around the world in places like Pakistan or Yemen or Somalia, to it's changing the role in our democracy of who authorizes them or not. What's the role of Congress or the executive branch? But equally, when we talk about going to war, it's led to new experiences and stresses for those individuals, those warriors who go to war. and what it does to them, but also to their families. You know, for instance, for my book, I remember speaking with a U.S. Air Force officer who talked about waking up in the morning, driving 20 minutes into work, spending 12 hours putting missiles on targets, killing enemy combatants, and then, as they put it, you get back in your car and you drive home, and 20 minutes later you're talking to your kids at the dinner table about their homework. Another female pilot, actually from the Air Force, talked about the weirdness of standing in line at a Burger King about an hour after being in a combat mission and killing someone. That notion, this notion of distance but simultaneity of war, is a reality. But what motivates me wearing the other hat is that the fictional world hasn't caught up to that reality. That is, we have these two different distinct places, but in terms of telling the story of the new face of war, the fictional world hasn't done it yet. Another way of putting it is that we have one of the most important changes in 5,000 years of war, and there's always been a nexus of war in the arts, and yet we aren't seeing that nexus played. And so that's how I got involved in this project, aside from my day job in the policy world, is a project in the fiction side called Unmanned that was mentioned. It's a fictional story, but it's entirely based on real-world experiences. It started out as a short, and then working with a team of young filmmakers from AFI, we turned it into a script, and now we're essentially on the trail of trying to build out an indie film project around it. We've won awards from Sloan Foundation, been to Tribeca, the LA Film Festival, and we're basically doing right now what's called the Hollywood Shuffle. And essentially the idea of it is it follows a young pilot who's given the mission of his life, an exciting, complex mission in a post-Bin Laden world to hunt down a key terrorist leader. But then the strike goes wrong, and we have a mystery to piece together. Both what happened, why did that strike go wrong, but also a bit of a ticking clock. Both how do we find that terrorist leader who got away, but also there's an investigation, a court-martial, where our young pilot might be the junior officer who sort of hung out to dry as they look for someone to hold responsible for it. But at the same time that this is happening, you can do something else that wasn't possible in fiction that is now playing in war, which is a character piece to explore what does war do to a young man going to war for the first time, but simultaneously as they wrestle with the other tough role that young men have, which is being a father and a husband for the first time. And so we have the combat impacting on him and his young family. And at the end of the day, the narrative is essentially about a truth that I think holds across those 5,000 years, which is all war, even high-tech ones, come with consequences, real human consequences, both on the people and the places of action, but also on those who carry out the conduct of war. It's an important story that we want to tell, but it's also been a fascinating experience of seeing how does Hollywood deal with, or maybe not deal with, the realities of modern day war. The second project deals with the other way that robotics is a transformative technology that's out there. Literally, it will reshape our industrial landscape. This is a technology that is as important as the steam engine was. There's a series of questions that come out of it that we've touched on here in law and privacy, but one of the big ones that concerns me is just simply whether America can compete in this new economy. And this relates to the building that we're in. American high school students rank 23rd in science and 31st in mathematics when it comes to wealthy countries. We're 27th in college graduates with degree in science and math. So this other project is a nonfiction project. It's a documentary called Robot Dreams, and I'm working with a team of documentarians who've done other pieces looking at sort of the nexus of technology and policy and science, films like Hacking Democracy or Weight of the Nation. And what we do is that we're essentially following a group of young students, high school students from a school in Harlem, as they compete in a robotics contest in a series called FIRST. And if you don't know about FIRST, it's a really neat thing, but the experience for the young students is basically a cross between being on a sports team and in a tech startup, except they're in the ages of roughly 15 years old. And so what they're doing is they have weeks to build a robot that NASA couldn't build a couple years ago. And then after they've designed and built this robot, they compete against schools from around the nation in competitions as essentially these robots play and carry out missions as their fellow students and families watch. So you have all of the science and the engineering, but you also have kind of the personal excitement here. The difference in why we particularly follow these students is that their stakes are high. It's high for the nation. It's a way to draw in kids into science and engineering who wouldn't normally be drawn into these fields, but it's also huge for them. Many of them are seeing this as, on one hand, it's getting them interested in going to college and careers that never would have crossed their concept space previously, and the other is a way for many of them to win scholarships to make this possible and build mentor networks that literally will change their lives. So we hope we can get these two projects off the ground, but the bottom line takeaway for me to wrap it all together, and I think it ties into these other talks that you've heard, is that we're living in a world of science fiction meets science reality. Essentially, our technologies are allowing us to do things that we couldn't imagine we'd be doing a decade ago, whether it's carrying out these kind of missions, performing these kinds of roles, to creating legal and policy and ethical questions that we didn't imagine we'd be dealing with, to, for me personally, basically going from being a policy wonk to trying to play in these other worlds, and it's been a fun and neat but surprising experience. So I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.